Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of The Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, which also provide you the much important avenue to practice daily answer writing. In the first topic, in the light of the flight cancellations which has overhauled the Indigo Airlines, we'll try to assess the prevailing issues in the civil aviation sector of our country. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to assess that how the child marriage still remains a blot on Indian society even in the year of 2025. Then from a simplified section, we'll take up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide you the much important value addition keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2026. So stay tuned. Where the article highlights the step which has been taken by the Ministry of Civil Aviation to tackle the issues which are being faced by the passenger due to the Indigo Airlines overhaul, reflecting at the prevailing issues in the civil aviation sector, which forms an important component of your GS3 paper. So what is the context of the issue? Well, recently, the Union Government or the Ministry of Civil Aviation has imposed caps on airfares, set a kind of a timeline for refunds, and also has announced special trains to help the stranded passenger, as Indigo, which keep in mind the country's largest domestic airline, has begun a kind of a slow return to the normalcy. The airline, Indigo Airline, has actually experienced a near total outbreak down of the operations and had cancelled 2 out of every 3 of its scheduled flights on the Friday. Indigo, which is the largest domestic airline in our country and operates 2,200 flights on daily basis, thus constituting for 6 out of 10 domestic passenger, is actually facing consistent flights delayed and the cancellation of the flights, which has basically left the passengers scrambling at the airport. So for example, on 5th of December, when you guys were comfortably sitting at your home and watching Analyst by an interesting person, on the very same day, there were 400 Indigo flights which were cancelled, thus bringing down the on-time performance ratio for Indigo, which was as high as 88% in the month of February 2025 to 35% on 2nd of December and to a historic low of 8.5% on 4th of December. This basically implies that only 8 out of 100 flights of Indigo were actually reaching on time or were actually functioning on time. So why these issues has occurred? What are the reasons, or some people or news channels as they allege, excuses which has been given by the Indigo? The first and foremost is the technology glitches. So for example, to actually have an effective functioning, these airlines, they majorly rely on a centralized information and technology system, where they use basically such kind of a centralized IT system for the booking of your tickets, to provide you check-ins, to actually generate your boarding passes, or to monitor the baggage or the landing of the baggage. So if there takes place any outage or slowdown in this centralized IT system, then these flights or the ground staff does not have any other option but to resort to manual operation, which obviously is much slower, also much error prone, leading to what? Long queues, delayed boarding, missed flight. As it was highlighted very recently by Indigo as well as Air India, that how the Microsoft based such centralized IT system has actually faced an outage. The second issue which has been cited by the Indigo is actually kind of associated with the safety of the passenger. So for example, to have a kind of an effective control on the flight when it is, let's say for example, basically flying in the air, or to actually prevent it from any kind of airborne disaster, frequent aircraft software update is very important. For what? For smooth navigation of it, to actually have a firm control when the flight is actually in the air, or to actually establish a good communication with the aircraft traffic control room which actually exists at the ground level. So to do all of this, many of the time, the manufacturers or the regulatory bodies, they keep on suggesting for such aircraft software update, which is basically mandated by such regulatory authorities. In this context, you guys can recall the incident which took place on 30th of October 2025, where there was an Airbus A320 being run by a company called as JetBlue, and this particular A320 aircraft actually experienced an uncommanded pitch down, even though the autopilot was still engaged and it faced no turbulence or any external cause. So, the kind of the malfunctioning which took place was actually traced down to this elevator aileron computer system, which is a very important flight control system. And in the simple language, it basically controls the tail and the wings of an aircraft to actually keep it firm in the air. So this elevator aileron computer, it actually faced vulnerability. Under certain space weather or solar radiation condition, the idea was that this computer basically got corrupted, which actually triggered a kind of a spurious elevator command, leading to nose down pitch of the aircraft, and thus it could have significantly hampered the security of the passenger. So, taking the cognizance of the issue, the European Union Safety Agency actually mandated all the A320 aircrafts around the world to actually go for a software fix. So, it generated basically a kind of an alert operator transmission that remove this affected elevator aileron computer immediately and go for a software update. Keep this in mind that in the Indigo's fleet of the aircraft, Indigo contains 200 A320 buses or aircrafts. So the issue could have been solved. Keep this in mind that such software update usually takes 1 to 2 hours only. But the delay of such one flight of 1 to 2 hours and many such aircrafts of A320, it actually had a kind of a cascading effect on the timings of every other aircraft. The third reason which has been cited by the Indigo is the schedule changes, which is very normal in this period. Why? Because the winter season has arrived. So it's very obvious that for the takeoff and the landing of the aircraft, there is a kind of a runway visual range factor which is required. So these aircraft shall have a runway visibility factor of at least 400 meter, which is bare minimum. But in the winter season, because of the mixing of the cold night which has taken place with the moisture, the cold weather and the moisture, and the inversion layer which has been created in the upper troposphere, it is very obvious that don't you think dense fog can be created in the winter time. I have a small suggestion to the authorities in Delhi. Please have a recheck. In Delhi, such low visibility can be caused by the mere existence of air pollution or smog also. Many of the time, such low visibility is actually caused by some external and natural factors on which we have very limited control, such as, for example, volcanic eruption. So you guys can recall how recently we were discussing that how various flights were cancelled after the Ethiopian volcanic eruption, which triggered the ash alerts for the Western India. In which regard, the kind of the Civil Aviation Authority which we have in our country, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, it also issued advisory directing the airlines to avoid such affected altitudes. The fourth reason which has been cited by the Indigo is the adverse weather condition which is linked with the impact of jet stream, which can cause severe turbulence in the airlines. Such severe turbulence can be caused by very strong winds, storms, jet streams. What are these jet streams? The jet streams are basically a narrow band of very strong winds which usually blow in the upper troposphere at the height of approximately 9 to 14 kilometers, and they blow in the direction from west to east. So basically these strong jet streams basically bring the kind of the snow or precipitation which we called as western disturbances, which originates from the Mediterranean Sea region and then it travels from the west to east. Why? Because sun is moving towards the Tropic of Capricorn. So it's very obvious that this particular plateau of the North India is going to have lower temperature in comparison to the temperate regions of Mediterranean, where the high pressure has been created. So from high pressure, the wind is blowing to the low pressure, bringing snow, precipitation. So such snow precipitation can actually get accumulated on the runway. And don't you think it can actually affect the kind of the taking off as well as the landing of the aircraft, impacting is lifting and braking. The fifth reason which has been cited by the Indigo, and this is the reason which has actually been upheld by the Hindu to be the most prominent one, is the updated crew rostering rules. What are they? So these are basically associated with the kind of a provision of social security nets to the pilots and the workers who are actually working in this aircraft industry. So to actually provide them a kind of a safety net for the pilots, in the month of February 2025, this year itself, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation actually brought certain rules. Till the month of February, just look at the on-time performance which Indigo had, and that was as high as 88%, and after that you guys can see that how there is taking place a significant decline. What is the causes of that? So to provide safety net to these pilots, DGCA said that now these airlines, they shall actually provide weekly rest of 48 hours to pilot, that is of approximately 2 days, which was earlier only 36 hours. Then, because many of the pilots were actually complaining for fatigue, the DGCA said that now quarterly you will actually report me of any such fatigue complaints by the pilots, and what are the actions which you have taken on that. Third, you'll also the DGCA basically changed the definition of the night duty and kind of extended the time period. So earlier it used to be from midnight to 5 AM only, but now DGCA further extended it to be 6 AM, and also specifically laid down that how such airlines cannot assign these pilots more than 2 consecutive nights of duty, and for such night duty these pilots would be paid extra also. Further, the airlines were actually directed that now these pilots can work for the total amount of flying in a particular day, it cannot extend beyond 8 hours, and the total duty period shall not extend 10 hours. So before this, before the kind of the application of these rules, Indigo was basically working as a lean and mean profit machine. Just look at the most profitable airlines in the world, Indigo being one of them. So for example, in the fiscal year of 24 to 25, Indigo basically incurred a profit of 7,000 crore rupees. In the very same year, they did not increase the salaries of the pilot or provided them any bonuses. So this is basically what we called as the existence of crony capitalism. Thus, it basically, because of this new issues and the rules which were brought by the DGCA, don't you think that now there were obviously the shortage of the pilot which Indigo was facing? Why? Because earlier they were basically coercing these pilots to actually work or fly for 13 hours a day. Now they could not extend them beyond 8 hours. First and foremost, they were not even accepting these rules, and they even asked for a deadline to be extended to the February of next year. So this shortage of pilots could have been fulfilled by Indigo by hiring new pilots, but obviously because they were working on the principle of profit maximization, they did not went for that. Rather, they asked their pilots to let go of their sick leaves or take some extra payment and keep working how you were. Forget about your right as a labor. In this context, also remember that there are several persistent turbulence in our aviation sector, which still exists and is hampering the civil aviation industry in our country. The first is the high fuel cost, which leads to excessive operating cost. So for example, for such a small Airbus A320 which has been grounded, it basically requires taxi fuel, trip fuel, contingency fuel, typically 5%, to cover some unexpected events like stronger winds or change in route, alternate fuel, final reserve fuel enough to hold 30 minutes for at least 1500 feet, as well as additional fuel. And all of this basically accumulate and constitutes of a minimum 6,600 kg of fuel, which we called as aviation turbine fuel. The majority of this aviation turbine fuel in our country is basically imported from countries like USA, Uzbekistan, Turkey, etc. Now, in this context, link it with the depreciation of the rupee which has taken place. So, don't you think for the same amount of aviation turbine fuel, now we are actually paying more in dollars, for example, to USA? So, obviously, this is leading to high fuel cost. For example, this aviation turbine fuel itself constitutes for almost 30 to 40% of the carrier's operational cost in our country. Also keep this in mind that first and foremost, this fuel has actually become more expensive. So in this context, there is only one option which is left for the airlines like Indigo, that they will basically increase the fare to still remain profitable. But if they increase the fare up to a certain level, don't you think that the demand is actually going to decline? People will say that no problem, I will travel to Kanyakumari, I will take 3 days, I have enough amount of time, anyway I am unemployed, why I will pay this much of money? Or they actually work on some very thin margin of profit which actually act as a kind of a deterrent to any kind of large scale private capital investment in this sector. One more structural issue which remains with this concept of aviation turbine fuel is that it is not covered under the unified goods and services taxes. Rather, the state charges value-added taxes on this aviation turbine fuel, which ranges up to 25 to 30% in Delhi. Thus, there is no unified taxation on the aviation turbine fuel. So, basically, the ticket prices will vary from state to state also. That is also another issue. Second major issue is the absence of any domestic maintenance, repair and overhaul services. Just look at the data here. 90% of the aircrafts which function in our country, they actually go abroad for maintenance, repair and overhaul. So basically, the domestic capacity which we have, the domestic capability which we have, that is only our share in the world's maintenance, repair and overhaul services is abysmal 1%. So for example, as per a Deloitte report of 2021, if we actually generate indigenous capacity of this maintenance, repair and overhaul, it can actually lead to saving of $2 billion every year, and it will also generate 90,000 jobs every year, thus kind of fulfilling the economic survey target that we shall generate 78.5 lakh non-farm jobs every year to actually accommodate the demographic dividend which we have. Second, because of this absence of the domestic MRO services, it basically transpires to what? It leads to supply chain and engine aircraft maintenance issues, leading to what? Capacity crunch, frequent groundings of the aircrafts which takes place for months actually. For example, in January 2025 itself, Indigo actually grounded 60 to 70 aircrafts due to the powder metal contamination. Or in the month of March 2025, 133 aircraft, which basically comprises 16% of India's entire commercial fleets, were grounded because of the absence of these MRO services. Let's say somehow we manage this issue of aviation fuel. Somehow we also basically integrated it with the MRO services in our country. And now this flight is basically ready to depart. But from where to where because of the infrastructure bottlenecks which exist. Where in our country there exist insufficient, outdated or poorly distributed airports. So to put a perspective in your mind, remember that almost in our country as of 2025 there exist 149 operational airports. So it basically implies that these 149 airports are catering to a population of 1.5 billion people. That basically implies that one airport is actually catering to passenger load of 94 lakh people. Thus, in various tier 2 to tier 3 cities, there exist inadequate runways, lackway of passenger amenities, as well as outdated air control system. So basically the regional penetration of civil aviation system in our country is abysmal. And don't you think that also ends up hampering the regional development? Ultimately, for example, the private companies, now they are basically deterred to actually invest in this non-profitable aviation sector of our country. Why? Because of the frequent financial stress, thin margins of profits on which they have to work, as well as the seasonal volatile demand which exists. So to tackle with all of these issues, the government said no problem. In the year of 2017, they basically launched a new scheme which was Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik or Udan. The idea was to make this air flying profitable, to actually take it to the masses by creating small airports in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities and improving the air connectivity for such tier 2 and tier 3 cities. The government said, see what we are going to do. Let's say you have 100 seats. We are going to provide you a viability gap funding or a kind of a subsidy for the 50 of the seats in the aircraft. What you have to do, because we are providing you subsidy for that, you ensure that for such 50 seats in every aircraft, the airline will sell these 50% seats at a flat rate of 2,500 rupees per hour of flight. So let's say for example, if from Delhi to Bangalore, it takes place 2 hours. So the cost will be only 5,000 rupees for 50% of the seats. But from where the government will actually take this subsidy? Government said that we will actually going to take this subsidy. The cost will be borne by the Indian airlines who are flying in the kind of the tier 1 cities. Bombay to Delhi, Delhi to Bangalore, Bangalore to Chennai. So these kind of the major metropolitan cities, they were not the part of this regional connectivity system route or called as non-RCS route. So cost borne by the Indian airlines will be flying on the non-RCS route. So whenever, let's say for example, you are taking a plane from Bangalore and it is going to land on Delhi, which is basically a kind of a non-RCS route, then you will end up paying the government 15,000 rupees per departure. Airline can further pass this levy, right, or this cost of subsidy to their passengers on the non-RCS flights, because the government said that obviously anyone who is flying from Delhi to Bangalore will obviously be rich only. Why the poor people will actually fly from Delhi to Bangalore? It is your fault actually. So the viability gap funding share was set up with central government bringing 80% and state government bringing 20%. But the scheme itself is kind of mired by various shortcomings. For example, in the budget 2023, the budget allocation to this Udan scheme was 1,244 crore. But in the budget 2024, it actually came down to a meager 502 crore rupees. The reason for that is that there has been ineffective implementation of this Udan scheme because of several reasons. For example, in the year of 2017, so the scheme was launched in 2016 and the routes were identified in the year of 2017. So 479 such regional connectivity scheme routes were identified. However, almost 225 of those routes have actually ceased operation. Why? Because the airlines have basically cited several challenges which they are facing. So let's say for example, there is a flight which is connecting Prayagraj to Kanpur. It belongs to a regional connectivity scheme. The people are saying that okay, I will go to the airport, it will take me 1 hour. I have to reach there 1 hour before. Then I will sit in the flight. Then flight will take off. But there was winter. There was basically snow accumulation on aircraft. My flight is delayed by 30 minutes, 1 hour. I reach there. My baggage lands. The baggage which I have got is not of mine, of someone else. Somehow I finds my baggage. By the time I come out of the airport, it has taken me 3.5 to 4 hours. That is the exact time it will actually take me to travel by the road from Prayagraj to reach to Kanpur. Why I will fly? Leading to what? Low occupancy problem. Commercial flights have basically said to the government that almost 128 such routes which you have identified, they are commercially unviable for us. Then these flights are facing various operational constraints, like for example short runaways, lack of night landing facilities, inadequate terminal capacity, insufficient ground service. So why as a private company, let's say for example even if I want to work upon marginal profit, why I would like to actually invest in a kind of a loss making entity? I will not. Leading to what? Lack of private investment. These are the structural issues which prevails in the Udan scheme, and thus there can be a way forward. What we can do, what you guys will do as a future bureaucrat. First and foremost, we need to actually cut down the aviation turbine fuel cost which exists, because that kind of comprises of 40% of the cost. So if you want to make the tickets cheaper, it is very important for us for what? To blend at least 1% of sustainable aviation fuel by the year of 2025, and 5% of such blending shall be done by the year of 2027. Just use here how see here like how sustainable aviation fuel using the indigenous feedstock and make in India technology is a major step towards self-reliance and decarbonization of the aviation sector. Following this principle, India's first commercial passenger flight using indigenously produced sustainable aviation fuel actually took a flight in the year of 2023, which was Air Asia I-5767. Further, we can actually rationalize the fuel pricing by doing what? Bring this aviation turbine fuel under the goods and services tax and charge as minimum as possible. We can also scale up such sustainable aviation fuel production by using what? Ethanol, non-edible oils, waste food stock. Further, we need to expand the indigenous manufacturing. For that, the government has already provided 100% foreign direct investment. What we can further do is that many of the time we have seen that this kind of the focus of production linked incentive scheme is limited to kind of electronic equipment manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing, textile manufacturing. But what about the manufacturing of the aviation sector components? So in this sector, we can actually promote startups by doing what? By linking this PLI with public-private partnership model. Also, we can expand the infrastructure of these airspaces. So for short time, we can actually phase-wise use the military airspace for civilian use. And ultimately, we need to strengthen the regulation by the Directorate General of Civil Aviation through what? Through data-driven audits of these private airlines as well as AI-based monitoring. So the use of technology. If anyone could have remembered all of these suggestions, just look at the kind of the answer that person would have written for this year mains examination. There is a practice question, attempt that, and we move forward to the next news, in which a civil society network is actually conducting intensive drive to completely weed out the practice of child marriage, specifically in the state of Rajasthan, where still 25.4% of the women marry before the age of 18 years. The issue of child marriage, which forms an important component of your GS1 paper under the larger theme of social issues. So what is the historical backdrop of child marriage in our country? When the Britishers arrived in our country, and so arrived the Christian missionaries and the Anglicists, etc., and they started criticizing the decadent Indian civilization of that point of time, one of the very important aspects of their criticism basically revolved around the concept of child marriage. So for example, at that point of time, whatever the laws, rules, customs which we had, they actually put impetus on the chastity of women as a very important quality to be the life partner. For example, the chapter 9 from verses 88 to 94 in Manu Smriti, it basically recommends that a girl child shall get married before she attains puberty. Then came another political thinker whose name was Medatithi. Medatithi basically wrote a text called as Manu Bhashya, which is nothing but a kind of a commentary on Manu Smriti, where he interpreted this age of marriage to be done before the attainment of puberty to be minimum of 8 years and maximum of 12 years. So basically, Medatithi established that a girl child shall get married by the age she attains the age of 12 years. This was also upheld in the Mitakshara school. However, in the Daya Bhag school, which was more prevalent in the eastern India and specifically in Bengal, Daya Bhag school recommended that a woman shall get married only after she has attained puberty. However, keep this in mind that marriages in our country is not just a union between two lovebirds who want to spend their life together. Rather, it is a very important social institution where it acts as a kind of a social platform to actually make wealthy and profitable connections, to actually increase your superficial prestige which exists in society. So, at that point of time, when the Britishers has arrived, they have led to the introduction of something called as Zamindari system. zamindari system, which was basically introduced under the permanent settlement system by Lord Cornwallis in the specific year of 1793. So that basically led to the accumulation of wealth by a certain class of people at that point of time, such as for example Zamindar, Jotedar, Mukaddam, Khut, Chaudhary, etc. This is not any different from the present situation which we are facing. For example, if we refer to the World Inequality Lab report of 2024, the rich 1% population of our country actually accumulates 40% of the national wealth. So similarly, at that point of time, there is a huge economic inequality which is prevailing. So for the betterment of the life of their girl child, the people from the poor economic background, they actually started marrying their young girl child to the old zamindars. For example, an instance has been provided by Bipin Chandra, who tells us that how there was a zamindar who was 80-year-old and he married his 8th wife who was only 12 years old at that point of time. So just imagine yourself as a bride of this young 60-80-year-old zamindar who not has one but both of his legs on deathbed, and thus this young zamindar, let's say for example, died. So as a woman at that point of time, you only had two simple choices. One, you perform sati, burn in the pyre of your deceased husband, or you actually choose to be a widow, where first and foremost you will be branded as a witch. Why? Because of your arrival only, this young and healthy zamindar of 80 years old has died. Second, you will be actually ostracized by the society. So in the lack of education and financial independence at that point of time, many of these women actually resorted to nothing but prostitution. For example, even today, the largest prostitution market in Asia exists at Sonargachi in West Bengal. So that basically kind of attracted a huge criticism by the Christian missionaries at that point of time, and thus the social reformers of our country, they started basically propagating the idea of a suitable age of marriage for the girl child. First, it was actually propagated by the Desrosiers, who were followers of the Henry Vivian Desrosiers, who basically led the Young Bengal movement. So they created a kind of a society for acquisition of general knowledge in the year of 1838 to kind of demand for the abolition of child marriage. The same demand was also led by the Keshav Chandra Sen, who played a pivotal role in the expansion of the Brahmo Samaj. For this purpose, he specifically created an Indian Reform Association in the year of 1870. And because of his efforts, because of the efforts of Keshav Chandra Sen, the Britishers basically enacted a Special Marriage Act of 1872, where they kept a kind of a minimum marriageable age for girl child at that point of time, which was 14 years. But keep this in mind that here there was a loophole. If as a father I want my girl child to be married only after 14 years, and 14 years is the minimum age, and thus I am not following the Mitakshara or Daya Bhag school, in that particular case, I would be basically have to leave my religious practices. I will have to be religiously neutral at that point of time. Don't you think that would end up acquiring a lot of social backlash? I will be basically ostracized from the society and the community in which I live in. Why I will dare to do this? So this issue of child marriage again came into the front of the national furor at that point of time and discussion table with the Rukma Bai case which took place in 1885. Rukma Bai, which is famously considered as one of the first women practicing doctor in our country at that point of time. So when Rukma Bai was at the age of 11 years, she ended up marrying Dada Bai Bhikaji, who at that point of time was 19 years. And it was decided that when Rukma Bai will attain puberty, she will basically be sent to the Dada Bai Bhikaji's home. 11 years passed away. Rukma Bai now was 22 years old and Dada Bai Bhikaji was 30 years old. One day, Dada Bai Bhikaji was walking on the road and suddenly he remembered that, hey, wait a minute, I was married also. So he went back to take Rukma Bai back to his home. But Rukma Bai was a very studious student, unlike you people. So she now had at that point of time had decided that she will practice her career in medicine and thus she did not want it to go to Dada Bai Bhikaji. Dada Bai Bhikaji was thankfully no Kabir Singh. So he took a legal route and went to the court. for the application of marriage. This particular case is famous as Rukmabai versus Dadabai, the Bikaji case of 1885, which was fought by D.M. Malabari and Pandita Ramabai, in which there was a judge, and the judge was Pinhi, Robert Hill Pinhi. Robert Hill Pinhi actually ruled in the favor of Rukmabai and said that if she do not want to, let's say for example, apply the marriage which has been conducted, she is free to do so. However, this action actually was severely criticized by Bal Gangadhar Tilak in his newspaper Maharatta, where he said that basically Britishers do not know anything about our Indian culture and custom. They are intruding in our culture. So to further sensitize the people, to do social engineering, M.G. Ranade, who actually created Indian Social Conference in the year of 1887, under this banner lodged a pledge movement, where the members of this particular conference used to take a pledge that we will not marry our girl child as a kind of a, or let's involve her in a kind of a child marriage. This issue actually got further national furor in the year of 1889 because of the Fulmani Das case. Fulmani Das, who was basically a 10-year-old girl when she was married to Hari Chund Mathi, who had a criminal record, and just one night after her marriage, she basically ended up succumbing to death because of the sexual assault which was committed by her husband, that was Hari Chund Mathi. And thus the Britishers were forced to pass a Age of Consent Act of 1891, under which they said that the age of consent is now going to be 12 years. Remember, not age of marriage. So the Age of Consent Act of 1891 specifically deals with the consummation of marriage. The age of marriage for the girl child to be 14 years was ultimately decided by the passing of Sharda Act of 1929, and under the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1978, it was increased to 18 years, where it exists even today. 18 years for girl child and 21 years for a boy. What idea is that obviously after the application of this Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1978, such an affirmative action which has been taken by the government, obviously the issue of child marriage would have been completely wiped out from our country. But the data tells us otherwise. Just look at the status of child marriage in our country. How the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006, which basically lays down the marriageable age for girl to be 18 years and above and 21 years for boy. Even in the year of 2021, as per the NFHS 5, there were still 23% of the women in our country who actually ended up marrying before the age of 18 years. However, the number has almost halved down from being almost close to 47% in 2006. So this is the improvement which we have made in approximately 2 decades. But even today, as per UNESCO, India is home to 223 million girl brides, child brides. 33% of the global total. Even 17% of the men, they actually end up marrying before their legal age. The highest prevalence of such child marriage actually takes place in Bengal, where 41% of the girl child still gets married before the age of 18 years, and that's why the backdrop of the such prevalence of child marriage in Bengal was traced for you. It is lowest in Kerala, where it is only 0.1%. So what are the causes of child marriage in our country? Why it takes place at the first place? First and foremost, keep this in mind. If you guys can recall that when we were discussing the UNDP's multi-dimensional poverty index, we basically learned that how 18% of our country's population is still multi-dimensionally poor. That basically leads up to 23 crore people who does not have home, who does not have access to education, who are basically kind of deprived of basic amenities. So for such families, such early marriage of a girl child is nothing but a survival strategy. Because it leads to what? Fewer mouths to feed, educate, lesser dowry demands. So obviously these families, they cannot sustain feeding these girl childs, nourishing them, educating them, or paying for their dowry. Why? Because in our country, because of the patriarchal mindset, the social taboos, and the obscurantist ideas which prevails, the people believe that the girl child is nothing but a pariah dhan. because the male child is basically considered to be the harbinger of the next generation. But the girl child is eventually after marriage is going to someone else's house. So many of such people with their patriarchal mindset, they actually believe that the investment which they are making in the girl child will obviously will not lead to any return. And that's why in our country there prevails something which we called as son meta syndrome, which is reflected in the skewed sex ratio which we have. The second major issue is the lack of education. So for example, there is an NGO, the NGO which is called as People's Rights Activism Movement. So they basically kind of conducted a survey where they found out that 49% of the respondent of these child brides, 49% of them actually had educated up to only high school. So the first and foremost, they were not educated enough. Thus obviously they were not even aware about their rights. The ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity never reached to them. Also, it also basically implied that if they are not, let's say for example, well educated, they did not had financial independence in the form of a job. Thus, many of the time these girl childs are actually considered as a financial burden because their education does not translate to their employment in the labor force. Like for example, they face glass ceiling effect where they are deprived of any posting in the higher administration. For example, we can talk about the very inclusive UPSC. From the year of 1947 till 2025, as per the data provided to us by the Department of Personnel and Training, only 18% IAS officers have been women. Or for example, the taboo of pink job which is kind of painted on them, kind of depriving them of various blue collar jobs. This is also reflected in the Global Gender Gap Report where we have an abysmal ranking of 131. According to which 196 million employable women are actually outside the workforce. 93% of the women in our country are actually giving 7 hours average every single day on unpaid domestic services. Some of you will counter argue that no sir, female labor force participation rate has significantly improved. It is 41.7%, but keep this in mind, only 18% of these women actually work in any kind of formal employment where they are getting, let's say, benefits of Maternity Benefit Act or Janani Suraksha Yojana, etc. So there is also takes place the weak enforcement of laws. Like for example, we have Prohibition of Child Marriage Act of 2006, which has very stringent provisions, but under the very same act, from the year of 2022 to 25, only 11% of the cases or accused has been actually convicted. Just look at the data here. An average of 7,000 women have died every year in horrendous cases where they are burnt, legally known as dowry deaths. So, what are the steps, some affirmative actions which has been taken by the government? The first and foremost is the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act of 2006, of which section 10 and 11 specifically says that if there is any person who is performing, conducting or abetting child marriage, imprisonment up to 2 years and a fine of 1 lakh rupees. Section 16 specifically provides for appointment of child marriage prohibition officers to actually prevent the child marriage and counsel the parents. Then section 3 leads to declaration of child marriage as voidable. That is also an option. So for example, let's say if someone forcefully let me marry when I was a child. So when I actually become an adult, I can actually go and file a petition for the kind of the violation of the marriage up to 2 years after attaining the majority. I hope I did that. I could have taken that decision, but unfortunately. Section 4, mandatory maintenance and residence for the female who leaves a child marriage. Section 12 provides for child marriage involving minors taken or enticed away is automatically void. And through this effort, almost 73,000 child marriages has been prevented from the year of 23 to 24 through community engagement and such legal interventions. Then to further educate the women, there is the idea of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. There is Balika Samriddhi Yojana to support their enrollment and retention in the schools, to provide them education. Sukanya Samriddhi Yojana, which promotes financial saving for the girls' education and marriage in the future. So the government is providing various such affirmative action. Also, there has been an idea that there was a recent a bill which has been brought in the parliament to actually increase the marriageable age of women from 18 to 21 years. Then to protect any kind of sexual violence against them, there is prohibition of child marriage as well as protection of child from sexual offences, POCSO Act of 2012. Because there are several kind of negative consequences, detrimental consequences of such child marriage on the health of a woman, keep this in mind. It increases their maternal and child health risks, such as for example low birth weight infants. Just look at, as per the National Family Health Survey, how 55.4% of the women who are married before 18 and how they are basically increasing in various such districts. So the idea is that such child marriage can actually lead to detrimental impact on the health of women, like for example early such pregnancies can lead to malnutrition, reproductive health risk, sexually transmitted disease. It also affects their mental well-being as well as the nutrition of the demographic dividend. In this direction, there is a NGO. The NGO is Just Rights for Children, a civil society network which has selected 38 such high-risk districts in Rajasthan to conduct an intensive drive to completely weed out the practice of child marriage. The drive will actually extend the support to the state government's action and use the resources of village panchayat to spread the awareness in the far areas. Further, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 5.3 to end the child marriage by the year of 2030, the Ministry of Women and Child Development has actually launched a 100-day intensive awareness campaign, which will be conducted in the phase wise in various schools and colleges, which will also involve the mobilization of Gram Panchayat to actually pass resolutions against child marriage in their jurisdictions. Keep these suggestions in your mind when you are attempting this particular question, and we move forward to the next news, where we will read about a very interesting case of DU Professor G.N. Sai Baba. G.N. Sai Baba, who is basically a 55-year-old wheelchair-bound academic, who was basically arrested in the year of 2014 under the provisions of Unlawful Activity Prevention Act, where the National Investigation Agency basically alleged that G.N. Sai Baba is the member of the banned Communist Party of India Maoist and is part of the larger conspiracy to wage war against India. So in this context, he was basically arrested under the provisions of UAPA and he was lodged in the Nagpur Central Jail, where in his memoir written as "Why Do You Fear My Way So Much?", G.N. Sai Baba highlighted that how he was not even provided the basic amenities. For example, he was not provided wheelchair, he was not provided any medical facility, he was not even allowed to meet his immediate family. Thus, taking the cognizance of these issues which led to the violation of his right to dignified life under Article 21 of the Constitution, a very important fundamental right, the Supreme Court basically held that prison authorities who abuse such disabled prisoners will be penalized under the Right to Person with Disability Act, and also directed all the states and UTs to change their prison rules, draw up new modalities to ensure that disabled persons with such special needs were provided assistive devices to aid mobility, specialized medical care, and enhanced visitation rights to access sustained family support. Supreme Court basically held that the Section 89 of the Right to Person with Disabilities Act will be made applicable to the prison establishments across the country, and all prison authorities shall take adequate steps to actually disseminate awareness of the obligation which is flowing from the said provisions to all officers, staff, legal aid personnel as well as stakeholders. The question which shall arise in your mind is that does there exist any official definition of the disabled people in our country? The answer is yes. First and foremost, as per the United Nations Convention on Right of People with Disabilities, it basically terms them as the invisible minority because as per the UNCRPD, there are 1.3 billion people living globally who can be classified as a disabled person. The official definition says that such a disabled person is basically a person who is facing impairment, activity learning, and participation restriction, which is very normal to the other human being. Does there exist any official estimate of such disabled people in our country? The answer is no. But as per the Minister of Social Justice reply, which he did in the Lok Sabha in 2024 to a question which was asked, he said that there exist approximately 2.68 crore or 2.2% of the population in our country can be considered as a disabled. Remember, 80% of such disabled population across the globe actually exist in developing countries, and 70% of them actually exist in underdeveloped rural areas. In our country, 54 lakh such people are actually disabled when it comes to the movement. So they have this locomotor disability, as it was being faced by the wheelchair bound Professor G.N. Sai Baba, who basically suffered it because of the post polio paralysis. Hearing and seeing as well, 50 lakhs. So as per the Right of Person with Disabilities Act of 2016, there exist 21 such categories: blindness, leprosy, dwarfism, intellectual disability, specific learning disability, hearing impairment, muscular dystrophy, acid attack victims, or the sickle cell disease, which basically impacts the tribal women in our country. The idea is that, has there any affirmative action which has been taken by the government for the disabled people? Yes. There exists Right of Person with Disabilities Act of 2016, the provisions of which are important for you for the prelims examination. So for example, Article 40 of the Act, it actually provides for right to equality, accessibility as well as reasonable accommodation. Section 3 basically states that no person shall be discriminated on the ground of disability. Under the Act, the provisions of RT, Right to Education Act 2009, has been further expanded. So it basically provides for free and compulsory elementary education from the age of 16 to 18 years. However, for normal people, it is 16 to 14 years only. High penalties for any such offences which are committed against such a disabled person, or faster adjudication under the special courts. However, G.N. Sai Baba was kept for years under UAPA. So don't you think it basically one provision of an act led to the violation of the other provisions of the act? Law versus law. Then the government puts a lot of affirmative action on the paper, but do they translate to the ground? Let's look at that. So under the provisions of the Act, the government increased the quota of reservation for such disabled people, where it said that in the public jobs, 4% reservation will be for such disabled people, and in the higher education, 5% reservation will be provided. However, if we refer to the data which was provided to us by the Hindu in the month of September itself, despite the 2016 law which raised the reservation to 4% in the government jobs, their strength has never crossed 1.1%. Just look at the data here. Group wise representation, it is lowest in Group A. In Group B, it is 1.53%. So their strength has actually remained between 20,000 to 22,000, making up just about 1% of the total workforce. So what are the issues which are faced by these disabled people? First and foremost is the policy blindness. Because there is taking place no data-based policy making, there is no official data from the estimate of the government. Thus, only 28.8% of such people with disabilities actually have the disability surfeit. 21% receive some aid from government. 1.8% receive some help from NGOs. Then there exists policy paralysis, where instead of actually providing cheap equipments to them, cheap wheelchair to them, the government is actually taxing these assistive devices or medical aids, like for example prosthetic limbs, wheelchairs, braillers. Just look here. Wheelchairs, hearing aids, crutches, braille paper still attract 5% GST. The government is like, no, even if you are disabled, you will have to pay us the money. So as per World Health Organization, such out-of-pocket expenditure actually accounts for 50% of the health expenditure of these people. Then as per the data which was provided to us by the UNESCO report of 2024, where there was a survey of public buildings in our country which was conducted by UNESCO representative, it termed our country as non-accessible India. 50% of such public buildings do not have ramps. 20% only have availability of wheelchair. Only 3% of the public buildings in our country are fully accessible for such disabled people who are facing such locomotor disability. So obviously government might be spending huge amount for them. Just look here. The union budget allocation, how it has consistently declined over the budgets. So In the same point of time, when J.N. Sai Baba, he actually faced such custodial violence. What actually transpires to this custodial violence? Let's have a short look at that as well. The first and foremost is the normalization of force over nudging, where the epithet in the police is that might of force is the ultimate solution, where these police officers are not actually trained to understand the psychology of a human being. It is exactly like a dominating parent, where they actually resort to quick beating of their children to teach them a lesson instead of work with them and do social engineering. Second, there is absence of any strong legislation. So India does not have any anti-torture legislation. So there is no legal deterrent on these police officers. Then we have signed UN Convention Against Torture in 1996, but keep this in mind, we have not ratified it. There also exist policy loopholes where there is less impetus on training and psychological care of these policemen. It's not like Singham. Policemen in India work 14 hours a day and get few week offs. 74% of the police station staff actually felt that their working condition affect their health as well as their mental health. As there does not exist any such strong legislation which can act as a deterrent, there is no accountability mechanism. Police officers in India rarely face conviction for death in custody. Only 21 officers actually faced conviction for such custodial violence in between 2005 to 2010. Then there exist such infrastructural challenges. No, let's say for example, basic installation of a CCTV. So what we can do? First and foremost, under Article 41, it's a directive principle of state policy. It itself suggests for the public assistance in the case of disability. And Supreme Court has also upheld in Rajiv Raturi versus Union of India that there shall be development of a minimum mandatorily accessibility requirement. Section 48 of Right of Person with Disabilities Act specifically suggests that there shall be social auditing of this scheme. We can also learn from global best practices like, for example, Canada, which is actually creating such accessible equipments across the public buildings because it want all of its 100% public buildings to be fully accessible by 2040. Then government shall actually bring down GST and make it GST free, specifically on the new technologies like, for example, Rewalk Robotics, which is actually creating bionic limbs with sensory feedback. In the context of police reform, we can take up the model which has been launched in Telangana, where institutionalization of mental health has been taken place, where they are directing 5% of their police budget actually towards district level mental health unit to actually inculcate the subjects and the disciplines of ethics, human rights, jurisprudence in the public training, police training, to actually make a kind of a enforce accountability through effective criminal justice system, to actually increase the conviction rate, to take strong actions against such police officer, and ultimately the use of advanced technology where we can monitor their actions consistently. So through this, we have covered two important aspects. One is prison reform and the issues of custodial violence, as well as the such custodial violence on disabled people and the issues faced by them. And through this, we move forward to the next news, which will be very easier for you people to understand if you have watched the last analyst. So for example, the today's article in the Indian Express, it tells us that after breaching the 80 per dollar mark in July 2022, following the supply chain shock which was caused at that point of time by the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the rupees exchange rate has actually moved south pretty quickly, taking just 3.5 years to actually hit the mark of 90. And this has occurred despite India's current account balance easing sharply from a deficit of $31 billion in the year of 2022 to even being in surplus for a couple of quarters. So it's not like we have very significantly faced trade deficit or kind of a current account balance payment crisis in the recent years. So first and foremost, let's understand the balance of payment mechanism which exists in our country. There are two accounts. One is current account, other is capital account. In current account, we actually calculate the trade which takes place in good and we can see them. So it is called as net visible. Where let's say for example in fiscal year 2024, we had an export of $441 billion and we imported $683 billion. So we obviously had a trade deficit of $242 billion. So this $242 billion is a kind of a currency in dollar which we shall have to pay for the extra import which we are doing. But we are also getting money from other sources, like for example, that current account also consists of services, where we had a surplus trade of $142 billion. Then the transfer payments, the remittances, so the Indians who has gone abroad and they send money back, they have sent us $106 billion. So the total deficit was actually coming down to only $30 billion only, the extra foreign currency which RBI is required to keep to actually pay for that. Capital account consists of the foreign investment, foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment, any extra commercial borrowings, any NRI deposit or the loans which we have taken from IMF. In this context, the today's article says that the inflow of the foreign currency to our economy, that is basically declining because of several factors. First of that factor is the drying capital inflow. So the money has stopped coming in our country. Like for example, just look at the foreign direct investment in 2022, then 23, 24 and 25. Look at the equity foreign portfolio inflows. Even that has significantly declined. Look at the non-equity FPI inflows. Even that has declined in comparison to the last year. So capital inflow has significantly declined in our country. The article gives us two reasons. One is the anxiety on the growth front, that whether India will keep on following the trajectory of GDP growth as it is registering right now or not, considering that we are unable to create so much of jobs. The propensity to consume of the customers is not increasing. There is not enough money in the hands of the large masses to actually keep on generating demand. Second is the unfinished India-USA trade deal and the kind of the tariff imposition which has been done on our products by USA. Similarly, the foreign direct investment in our country has also declined. Just look at the net FDI over the course of year. Look at the kind of the repatriations and outbound FDI. So FDI from our country, that has kind of significantly increased in the last year. So the changing terrain on FDI, higher interest in foreign countries. So now the investors, instead of investing in the country, they are actually getting more returns from other countries, they are investing there. Then the Indian investors are also now investing more abroad. Why? Because of the localization of supply chain. So the article basically suggests that, see, if we want our products to be sold in USA, we also require to have a little bit of funding, investment, which we shall do in that market to kind of showcase our presence. So that's why there is an outbound FDI which is also taking place from Indian market. Then what are the steps which has been taken by RBI? So if you look at the RBI's foreign currency sale, just see how it increased in the last few months. RBI has almost sold $400 billion of foreign currency in this year itself. So if, let's say for example, RBI has sold this dollar, the supply of the dollar has increased in the market. In the comparison of that, the demand of the rupee is actually now going to increase. Because supply of dollar has increased, so its demand has declined. In comparison to that, the demand of rupee has increased. So obviously rupee is going to appreciate as it happened. But even then, the RBI is actually keeping a high tolerance for rupee depreciation. Why? Because keep this in mind, if our currency will depreciate, our exports will actually get benefit because they will become cheaper. So people will start buying more Indian products, and thus through this we'll be able to tackle the tariff imposition by USA. But the article suggests that how we shall actually focus on creating the demand for Indian products and not only relying on this kind of the balance of payment or fixed exchange system or floating exchange system, etc. And with this we move forward to the next news, where we are going to learn about an invader who invaded our country, and a huge chapter has been dedicated on that invader in our NCERT. So the new class 7th NCERT, which has been published and you guys should read them too, has actually a larger section now on the Ghaznavid invasion, focusing on the Mahmud of Ghazni's destruction and plunder and his eagerness to spread his version of Islam to non-Muslim parts of the world. So basically to convert Dar-ul Harb to Darul Islam, right? So the idea is that this particular section of the Ghaznavid invasion is actually preceded by a box that contains a word of caution, and this is similar to the note on the history's darker periods. So keep this in mind just for your larger understanding of who was Mahmud Ghazni and why he was invading our territory. When the Prophet Muhammad, who basically considered as the founder of the Islam, he died in the year of 632, basically the caliphate was divided into 4 different tribes at that point of time: Rashidun, Umayyad, Abbasid and Fatimid. From this Umayyad dynasty, there was an Arab general Muhammad bin Qasim who became the first invader who invaded Sindh in the year of 711 C, and he at that point of time defeated Raja Dahir. And there was a kind of a valor, or the kind of a story which we read of the courage of the Rani Bai, who put a very strong resistance against the invasion of Muhammad bin Qasim. From this Abbasid dynasty, there started emerging another tribe which was Samanids, who ruled from the region of Khurasan and Iranian provinces. From this, there emerged the Ghaznavids from the region of Afghanistan, who started attacking the fertile region of the northwest India at that point of time, which is being drained by the Indus and its 5 tributaries, and thus it is very fertile and productive, and thus they are generating huge revenue also. So at that point of time, the first line of resistance were Hindu Shahi rulers, who ruled from 843 to 1026 C, who had their capital as Udband or Vehind. So Jaipal, the ruler of Hindu Shahi, was defeated by Sabut Kagin in the year of 1986. And thus, when Sabut Kagin was replaced by Mahmud Ghazni as the new ruler of the region of Afghanistan, he led 17 expeditions to our country, where he called him as a Butshikan, or the destroyer of the idols, as well as he basically targeted all the rich provinces, fertile river provinces, as well as the temples, because they were at that point of time were accumulating a large amount of wealth. So his expeditions has been highlighted in the book called as Shahnama, written by Firdausi, where he talks about the Battle of Peshawar, in which he defeated Jaipal and thus annexed the territory, all the territory west of Jhelum. Then in the Battle of Chhach, he ended up defeating Anandpal, and he basically extended his territory at that point of time till the Jhelum river. And from there he started attacking the Gangetic Delta after that. So his expeditions are basically has been highlighted, or in one of his expeditions in the year of 1017, he was also accompanied by a Khwarizmian Iranian traveler called as Al-Baruni, who basically wrote a book called as Tehqeeq-e-Hind and accompanied one of the such Mahmud Ghazni's expedition in the year of 1017 C, where in our country, he is basically considered as the father of Indology. So he was the first person who actually, showed interest, learned Gita, Upanishad and Purans. He also translated several Sanskrit work, including the Patanjali's work on grammar called as Mahabhashya in Arabic. For his Brahman friend, he actually translated the work of Euclid into Sanskrit. But he also provided a very important critique of the Indian society, where Al-Biruni basically stated that Indians, they have become so full of themselves that they have become completely oblivious to the technological developments which are taking place in the West. And any society which is so full of himself is bound to fall. And what was the prophecy? So, in the year of 1192 C, through the second battle of Terain, it was basically Mahmud Gori who ended up defeating Prithviraj Chauhan, which led to the establishment of the Mamluk dynasty in our country, and that is called as Delhi Sultanate as well. In this book of Tehqeeq-e-Hind written by Al-Biruni, he also tells us about the Somnath temple, which is the first Jyotirling of Mahadev in the Prabhas Patan region of Gujarat, which is mentioned in Mahabharata, Ramayana and Bhagavad Puran, which was basically commissioned at that point of time by the Gurjara Pratihara king Nagbhatta II and ultimately completed by the Solanki king Mool Raj. So Al-Biruni tells us in Tehqeeq-e-Hind that how this Somnath temple was actually destroyed by the Butshikan Mahmud of Ghazni. So when we got our independence, on the order of the Deputy Prime Minister Sardar Patel, the renovation and the restoration of Somnath temple took place, and that was requested to him by none other than Mahatma Gandhi. So on the 11th of May 1951, there was an installation ceremony which took place, and it was attended by our first president. Have this information in your mind, attempt this very easy question, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to learn quickly about the parliamentary proceedings in the light of an article which has been written by one of the leader of opposition, where he writes that how our Prime Minister made some provocative remarks on the start to the winter session of the Parliament. where Prime Minister said that there are one or two parties that cannot even digest their defeat. But here we should emphasize policy and not slogan. The opposition leader basically emphasizes that in the parliament, the bills and the budgets are the government's agenda. The question hour does not allow for a discussion. A real freewheeling discussion at the instance of the opposition can only take place through an adjournment motion or through a short duration discussion or calling attention notice. So learn these terms very specifically for your prelims. Question hour is the first hour of every parliamentary proceeding, start right from the 11 am, where the members can ask the questions and ministers can answer. The questions can also be asked to a private member. The question are of the nature like, for example, stat, so the answer will be given orally. You can ask me counter question also. Then unstat or in a written format, so you cannot ask counter question. Short notice question, which is a question which has been given to a minister and you have less than 10 days for that to prepare. 0 hour starts right at 12 am. So the idea is basically it starts exactly at 12 pm to 1 pm. That is the idea. So it starts right after the question hour and before the agenda of the house, where you can actually raise matter without any notice. As it is not mentioned in any rules of procedure, it is an informal device and it is an Indian innovation since the year of 1962. Adjournment motion is actually specifically mentioned in the Rule 57 of the Lok Sabha procedure, where you can draw the attention of the entire house to the definite matter of urgent public importance, like for example the cancellation of the flights which are taking place. But for such adjournment motion to call the attention of the house, you will require the support of 50 members. Then there is calling attention motion, where you call the attention of the minister to some matter of urgent public importance. Here the minister is obliged to make a statement. Just like for example 0 hour, it is an Indian innovation since the year of 1954. The leader of opposition today, he has basically provided us a kind of a data which showcases the number of adjournment motion in the last few years, the number of calling attention notices which has been given. One of the major reasons for that is that for various years the Lok Sabha has actually remained oppositionless. So in 15th Lok Sabha, right, when the last time there was a UAPA government, they basically created a coalition. At that point of time, BJP was the single largest opposition party. In the 16th Lok Sabha, BJP ended up winning 282 seats and thus a clear majority. INC was reduced to 44 seats, but because this is less than quorum, that is 10% of the strength of the house. So 545 members in Lok Sabha, 10% of that will be 55. 44 is less than 55. I hope you know that much of a CSAT. So obviously there was no official leader of opposition. Same thing also remained in 17th Lok Sabha, as INC won only 52 seats. However, in 18th Lok Sabha, the Indian National Congress led India Alliance actually ended up winning 234 seats and thus that is more than quorum. So the leader of opposition now officially is Rahul Gandhi. If we talk about the table of precedence, where the leader of opposition is kept at par with which particular, let's say for example, the executive body, just comment down in the comment box and we move forward to the last news of the day, where there is a very interesting article which has appeared, which talks about that how the nuclear activities worldwide actually generate around 2 lakh meter cube of the radioactive waste every year. Of this, 10,000 meter cube contains most of the radioactivity which requires deep, long-term geological storage. This is the form of geological disposal facilities, GDFs, which are basically created at caverns, purpose-built hundreds of meters underground and packed with waste containers, cement backfill and a suitable host rock such as for example clay, so that this radioactivity or radioactive elements do not go outside. A cross-sectional view of such an intermediate level waste canister you guys can see. So the today's article says that how such deep geological disposal facilities rely on a cement including formations like Sebama to safely contain the radioactive waste. Researcher basically tasted such Sebama tablets in the synthetic groundwater with some alkaliphilic microbes in the varying organic carbon nitrate condition. And they actually found that such microbe induced carbonate precipitation which occurred only when organic carbon suitable electron acceptors are available. So in such high carbon niches, the microbes actually they precipitate carbonates that seal such micro cracks and ends up thickening the protective rims in the cement, and thus they can actually contain such radioactive elements as well. And thus they can prevent us from some various harmful impact of radioactive waste like neurotoxicity, let's say for example fibrosis, metabolic dysfunction, or let's say your decrease of oocytes, sperm defects, disorder of sexual hormones, etc. The control or the safeguard of such radioactive waste falls under the jurisprudence of International Atomic Energy Agency, which is very important for your prelims, repeatedly asked by UPSC, which was established in the year of 1957 as an autonomous organization under UN, which is headquartered at Vienna, Austria, and promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy and prevent its use for military purposes. Same International Atomic Energy Agency sets safety standards and monitoring framework for the radioactive waste as well. Keep this in mind. Also, in India, such radioactive waste is actually managed by Bhabha Atomic Research Center. So, there are currently 175 members of this International Atomic Energy Agency which comply with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now here, keep in your mind a very interesting paradox. India is indeed a member of International Atomic Energy Agency, even a founding member in the year of 1957. But India has not signed the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. Just remember all of these important facts. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.